Lord, thank you that you are the faithful one. Lord, we grow tired easily. We get distracted regularly. And many times it's hard to see what's around us because we're anxious, because we feel like life it's uncertain at times. And I pray, Lord, that out of such weakness, out of such neediness, that it truly would be your Spirit, your word, alive in the heart and the mind of your people, so that everything we do, Lord, that it would be so awesome that we could not possibly take credit, but that you would be the explanation, even through vessels as we are before you. Broken, but with much hope. So lead us now, Lord, and open our hearts and minds to continue learning, dialoguing, praying, and acting. We say all this with certainty and confidence, for we ask it in the name of Christ, our Lord, our Savior. Amen.
From our civil rights generation to our young people up there, all the days of political process. This is what makes the city of Atlanta great. And when I think of the ideal party, I think of a party that prioritizes taking care of the least of these. A party that prioritizes investing in our youth. A party that makes sure that neither the widow, the fatherless, or the poor are forgotten or neglected. A party that makes sure that the worker is treated and paid fairly. A party that feels the pain and hears the aspirations of all people. Is that what you believe? And so I'd like to challenge us a little bit today. I'd like to challenge the Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party cannot afford to be a party that disregards, disrespects, or ignores its faith-based community.
Come on!
I got a lot of church folks in here. We need to make sure our faith-based community is respected. I know we have a senator here, we have other representatives here. Whether it's sanctity of life, whether it's issues with gender identity or family structure, as biblical Christians, those things don't change for us. But we deserve to be represented in this party. Because we know that we cannot have a strong country without strong communities. We can't have strong communities without strong families. And we certainly cannot have strong families without strong values. If we're going to save our children, we need strong values. Vote for me and my team over there.
Good morning, good morning. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out early this morning. That video shows something that a lot of people don't get to see. Who would have ever thought that you could win any political event in the heart of one of the most progressive cities in the nation with a pro-life, pro-family message that critiqued gender identity ideology? You see, that video was from Georgia's 5th Congressional District, their delegate, the Democratic National Convention delegate election in 2016. At the time, the 5th district was Congressman John Lewis's seat, and it was one of the most progressive districts in the state. My slate of Christian candidates won with significantly more votes than anyone else, and that was a surprise to many people. We won because we spoke directly to the people with grassroots organizing, finely tailored messaging, and the imagination and courage to talk about something and do something that most people would have thought was a fool's errand. That video was a small demonstration or example of what the AND campaign is trying to do on a national level, not just within the Democratic Party, but in general. to bring a diverse group of Christians together for civic engagement that puts faith first and breaks ideological orthodoxy for the sake of healing the land, that confronts partisan polarization for the sake of finding solutions and also healing the church. But in order to pursue a more healthy political landscape, Christians must understand and believe that the gospel application in the civic space is much more profound than conservatism and progressivism could ever be. We must understand that finding our identity in our political affiliation actually weakens and distorts our public witness. Our political affiliation can no longer, as we talked about yesterday, be religious in nature. Now, I'd be lying to you if I said that we won on that day and everything else was we lived on happily ever after. That video was actually just the beginning of a pretty interesting drama. As soon as we won and it was over, I was accosted by some folks in a certain community. They were trying to kick me off of the Georgia's delegation because they said that I had said things that were homophobic and transphobic, and you saw all those things. None of that happened. But thankfully, we were shrewd enough and we had been in politics long enough to anticipate that that was going to happen. And so we had the video, and when they came to me, I said, well, look at the video. None of that was said. But we also called pastors beforehand and told them to call the Democratic Party of Georgia to make sure they knew that there would be a problem if they mistreated us. And so the party backed away. I even had a longtime state senator say that she was going to ruin my political career right after that happened. And maybe most dishearteningly, one of my mentors told me that I had committed political suicide on that day. But when I thought about it, at first I was taken aback and a little hurt, but when I thought about it, he was actually right in a way. Something in me had to die in order to do politics the right way. And I think for a lot of Christians, there's a part of how we do politics that has to die. There's a part of how we see our opposition that has to die if we're going to be disciples in the public square. So I don't think we should run away from that happening. But that's one example of how the AND campaign has tried to say, this is different. That the messages that they say you can bring to an urban area aren't necessarily the messages that are always going to be successful if you do it a certain way and do it right. If you have your Bibles, please turn with me to Ephesians 4, verses 14 through 15. Ephesians 4, verses 14 through 15. And it reads, "Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of Him who is the head, that is Christ." Speaking the truth in love. Let's talk a little bit about engaging a polarized socio-political space with biblical fidelity. And I think the lesson today, what we'll be teaching, I won't hide the ball, based on biblical doctrine, is that we can't engage faithfully without love and truth, or put another way, without justice and moral order. We cannot choose our party over gospel imperatives, nor can we choose our political ideology over biblical doctrine. Some similar themes to yesterday. As we search for answers to the problems that afflict our society today, I'm afraid that many Christians have been tossed back and forth by the waves of false cultural doctrine and blown here and there by the winds of flawed pop culture prescriptions. We get exposed to a trending topic or a fancy theory in academia, and we begin to put our faith in political parties and ideologies that may talk good, that may flatter us, but that aren't actually edifying, that can show no proof of concept, and more importantly, that simply aren't biblical. But yet and still, based on the cultural identity of the messenger or the political party of origin. We follow that which leads to godless territory. So when it comes to political engagement, if the postmodernists are going to have their say, if the rugged individualists and the identitarians are going to speak up as well, the people of God must have something to say too, but we should not repeat them. When we speak, we should speak the truth in love. Are Christians speaking the truth in love in the public square today? The conversation about engaging politics to better society inevitably must address what teachings we follow and what methods we'll employ to achieve our objectives. Today, many Christians have been seduced by ideologies that are made by human hands and that can't withstand biblical scrutiny. The Bible speaks to this. In Ephesians 4, Apostle Paul is talking to the church of Ephesus. The church of Ephesus was known as the persevering church. Ephesus had endured a lot of suffering and also had false prophets who were trying to infiltrate the church with false teachings. Earlier in Ephesians 4, Paul talks about being mature. And the word he uses for being mature means growth in mind, growth in understanding, growth in knowledge of the truth, and growth in moral character. So he's saying that when we mature, when we grow in mind, when we grow in knowledge of the truth and moral character, then we will no longer be infants. We'll no longer be so malleable, impressionable, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching. Paul is saying that mature Christians aren't easily deceived, that these false teachers wouldn't be able to indoctrinate a mature Christian because a mature Christian knows what they stand for. Regardless of what false teachings are prominent, regardless of what pop culture is saying, and regardless of how much we are suffering, a mature Christian can speak the truth in love. Christians should never let their circumstances or the tactics of their opponents dictate who they are. See, a lot of people want to talk about the civil rights movement. We want to quote the civil rights movement, but I think a lot of people don't really want to engage what the civil rights movement was all about. Yes, it was about changing systems. Yes, it was about changing policy, but I think there was a foundational principle that was even more important than all of those things. And it was the idea that no matter how nasty or mean your opponent got, no matter what they did to you, you could not allow them to have a negative impact on your spirit. Because you could change policy, you could change systems, but if they had a negative impact on your spirit, you lost everything. We have to keep that in mind. We must always be able to speak the truth in love. And this doesn't just apply to our personal relationships, but our cultural and political interactions. Political and social ideologies are not all bad. We talked about that yesterday. You can decide whether progressivism or conservatism is best in a given situation. But one thing I will tell you is that they're not the gospel, that they are fallible. One of the biggest factors in our polarization is that many Christian conservatives can't tell where conservatism tends to go wrong. And too many Christians that are progressives can't tell you where progressivism tends to go wrong. We present these ideologies as if they're inerrant and argue for them in that way. The truth is that the most prominent ideologies are often separate love and truth as if they're in conflict, as if love and truth are mutually exclusive. One side is supposedly all about love, and the other claims to be about truth. And Christians are told to choose between the two. Well, I come to tell you today, brothers and sisters, that is a false choice. A Christian can choose a political party. A Christian cannot choose between love and truth. They're not in conflict. They're actually interdependent. You may have heard this name before, but I like the way that Tim Keller talks about this. He says that love without truth is sentimentality, meaning it's overly emotional. that it's lacking in substance, and that truth without love is harshness. It's mean, uncompassionate. We've been presented with a false dilemma. Our society has presented us with two wrong answers that has created a false dichotomy. This broken world has separated love and truth and separated social justice and moral order when they are supposed to go together, and when they're both inadequate without one another. These ideologies, again, tend to be lacking in truth or lacking in love. And as a result, when it comes to political ideology, to be conservative or progressive at all times and on every single issue is not only intellectually lazy, and that it is, it's also easily manipulated and, most importantly, unfaithful. Ideological conservatism and theological conservatism are not always the same thing. The far left's conception of social justice is not always consistent with a biblical understanding. If we're conservative, when the issue calls for change and the dismantling of old prejudice structures, then we're helping maintain injustice. That's not biblical. If we're progressive when the moment calls for the regeneration or preservation of moral order, then we're complicit in society's rejection of the truth. That's not biblical either. A Christian cannot simply follow behind an ideological tribe. We must be supplying them both with heavy doses of love and truth if we're going to be who we're called to be. It should pain us that any other community can legitimately question whether or not they are loved by Christians, or legitimately question whether the Christian community will treat them fairly. Now, we know that love doesn't guarantee agreement or affirmation, but it does call for us to be concerned about the well-being of others. You can understand systematic theology, you can memorize the entire Bible, but if you are unloving and uncompassionate, then you're not Christ-like. And this is where sometimes conservatives can run into trouble. We've been commanded to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we can't do that if we're not willing to advocate for our neighbors' well-being and to protect their human dignity. That's all a biblical definition of social justice is. According to the Great Commandment, if you would want justice for yourself, if you would seek it for yourself, then you have to want it and seek it for others. If we truly love our neighbors, then we'll be socially concerned. And that social concern won't just be a sentiment. It will be active and self-sacrificial. What have you given up for your neighbor? We supposedly have Christians that are against social justice. But I'll tell you a secret, I don't believe them. I think that everyone is for social justice. Some of us just limit it to the people we care about and deny it to others because it's an inconvenience. Let me give you an example. No one in here today is going to sit around and watch someone in their family be unjustly imprisoned. No one would allow their children or the children in their neighborhood to drink lead-poisoned water if there was something they could do about it. And why is that? It's because you believe in social justice. You believe that because of the Imago Dei, there's a certain standard by which every human being should be treated in a social context. We just have to make sure that we apply it to everyone. But we have to realize that justice is harder than charity, because sometimes we do charity really well, and God bless us for that. But we have to realize that justice is sometimes harder than charity. There's a reason that people will give you charity long before they give you justice. And again, charity is good, but charity can be distant, and the giver is in control of how it'll impact them, how much of it they give. Justice, on the other hand, is either given fully or not given at all. It's a God standard. It's not necessarily within our control. Justice threatens to disrupt the very systems and societal arrangements that benefit us. At some point, justice demands a conflict with self-interest. It dismantles the very podiums and platforms which we place our pride and stand atop to look down on others. There's no social renewal without love and social concern. If we don't have those things, you just create a harsh, hypocritical society that excludes marginalized groups. That's the love side of this equation. We're talking about love and truth. Let's talk about the truth side of it. In Ephesians 4:15, the term "speak the truth" comes from the Greek word that refers to teaching or professing the truth, often as it refers to doctrine. This is not subjective. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but everyone does not have their own individual, separate truth. To speak the truth means to profess right doctrine or to be honest in how you recount events. We worship a God of moral order. God's truth provides us with direction and structure in an ever-changing world that is unchanging. In urban settings like where I come from in Atlanta, and maybe here in San Antonio as well, a lot of people pride themselves on how progressive they are. And this is why I think progressives can run into trouble. To move forward and to fix things, that's how we think about progressivism. To move forward and fix things can be good. But being progressive is not the answer to every situation. Let me give you an example, an illustration. If you're on the edge of a cliff, to even lean forward or progress probably isn't such a good idea. It's also a bad idea to progress if you're already headed in the wrong direction. Sometimes God is asking us to stand firm on His word and preserve things and institutions that He has already established as good. Modern thought tells us that we can improve everything, but everything can't be improved. God's truth cannot be improved. And here's one way to think about it. We can think of God's truth sort of like a Picasso, a work of art. You cannot improve a Picasso. You can only deface a Picasso. If you go up to any masterpiece, and I don't care how great of an artist you think you are, with some type of brush and erasing agent, if you add anything to it or take anything away from it, you have ruined it. You have not improved it. You have made it worse. God doesn't need our counsel. He doesn't need us to improve or evolve His truth. Sometimes what seems good and pleasant to us is destructive. Sometimes God is calling us to obedience and self-denial. You don't hear that word used a lot in certain spaces. And this again is where people can run into trouble when they're trying to be progressive. Because it's hard to be obedient and deny self when you buy into a societal ethic that says that individual expression is sovereign. Can Christians fully embrace this philosophy and be faithful? It might be flattering, but you won't find an endorsement of that kind of philosophy here. Even if you only want to read the New Testament and the red letters, you won't find Jesus endorsing a human-centered, self-dictated truth or reality. This book tells us to die to self. It tells us to be crucified with Christ. This book consistently talks about self-sacrifice, not self-indulgence. Justin, are you saying that I can't be progressive politically? I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all, but when in conflict, your Christianity must override your progressivism, because progressivism, just like conservatism, is flawed. And if you can't find those flaws, if you haven't identified those flaws, you've got a problem. We can't exchange the truth for confusion and moral order for chaos. Jesus provided us a model for social renewal that was concerned about marginalized individuals in society, and I think we should pursue that same course. But he didn't simply patronize people with sentimentality. He attended to them with love and truth. If you go to John 8, the case of the adulterous woman who was about to be stoned, what does Jesus tell her? He tells her, go, which is his love liberating her from these hypocrites. From these hypocrites who are intent on hurting her, he's releasing her from this societal bondage. But he doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop there at all. He says, sin no more. Because the other half of the truth was that she would never completely be free until her heart changed and she turned from her sin. Similarly, in John 5, the lame man was told to stand up and walk, and then later told to stop sinning. You see, the woman wasn't only a victim of external bondage. Some of us only want to talk about external bondage. She was also a victim of her own internal bondage. The man's infirmity wasn't only an outward disability, there was also another matter that had to be dealt with by inward transformation. And there's a similar theme in Exodus. God delivered the Hebrews from Pharaoh's hand, but he didn't just go off and live happily ever after. That's where some people want the story to end. That's not where it ends. He gives them the law. He demands their obedience. He chastises them. Yes, God is a liberator, but he's also a father that requires moral order from the liberated. Let me say that again. Yes, God is a liberator, but he's also a father that requires moral order from the liberated. He brings wrath upon the oppressor and calls his children to self-denial so that they don't become the oppressor. But too many Christians have embraced ideologies that are keen on identifying how others have sinned against us while blinding us to how our own sin is devouring us from within. If the adulterous woman were here today, one side of the church would be saying, stone her, for she had sinned, and the other side would be saying, slay queen, live your truth. And both would be leaving her in bondage. Both would be leaving her in the same position in which she came. But that was not the pedagogic creed of Jesus of Nazareth. He taught that the unjust and disobedient would receive God's wrath, and that Christian love is unconditional, but it's not without discernment or critique. There is a way that seems right to man that ends in death. It's time for us to tighten up our philosophies, our methodologies and ideologies, and adhere to a much more gospel-centered standard. We often talk about partnerships. So yesterday I said a lot about ideologies and our secular peers and things of that nature, and I want to be clear, we should partner with others. There's good reason to partner with others, but there's a certain way to go about it. So let's talk about the way that Christians interact with others in the civic arena. It's done in some healthy ways, and it's also done in some unhealthy, unfaithful ways as well. For example, generally the distinction between or space between ideologically progressive Christians and the secular left is practically non-existent in the public square. If you look at the stances on different issues, you don't see much difference at all. And I don't think that's because the secular left is following the church. I think it's the other way around. We'll talk and have a conversation about common grace and what role that plays in this conversation. But to arrive at the same conclusion so frequently on so many different issues with moral implications seems highly unlikely unless the church is following behind of the world. It's more probable that we've outsourced our public witness for folks on the left to secular progressives. It's been outsourced. On the right, I've continually had people confront me like I've lost my mind for even suggesting that Christianity and the Republican Party aren't in some type of God-ordained covenant relationship. Where to split from, where people act like to split from the Republican Party and support a Democrat or do something like that is sin per se. Many people primarily think of evangelicalism as an ideologically conservative socio-political movement. And that's problematic. We have to fix that. You even have people who don't go to church calling themselves evangelical for political purposes. All the while, some evangelical leaders contend that to prioritize the character and morality of a candidate is now naive. In many respects, Christians aren't doing so well when it comes to our civic partnerships. But if you want to think the answer is not to engage, then I'd have to disagree with you. So it's true that sometimes the church is misled and misdirected by these relationships, but I don't think the answer is not to engage. We must engage non-believers, but we must do it in a better way. We must do it with hopefulness, but also with caution and conditions. In fact, in many cases, we should seek out these partnerships and realize that Christians don't have all the answers, that we can learn a lot of things from others, and we can take guidance from others in certain circumstances, and need to. We see it in the Bible. That said, we cannot enter into these partnerships haphazardly, and I've seen many of my peers enter into these partnerships without really thinking them all the way through. When corporations merge or partner with others, they do months and sometimes years of due diligence to know who they're getting involved with, to know what the end goal of this organization that they're with, to understand what that end goal is. Sometimes we just look at the one cause that we have in common and don't pay attention to all the other things that these organizations and these efforts are trying to do. And I really do think that's a mistake. As you know, we live in but partnerships, let me say this, partnerships are very important, especially when you live in a constitutional republic. In this form of government, you need partnerships. Christians can't do everything on their own. So we say, what is a partnership? Well, a partnership is people or groups working together for a common cultural, political, or economic cause. Partnerships being more formal, you could see a partnership, a political party is a partnership. We're all part of these partnerships. Democracy in its own way is a partnership within itself. What are some of the benefits of partnerships? Shared resources, increased numbers, diverse perspectives, added relationships. When you want to make change in a democracy, you need people. You need to organize. Again, everyone here today is in some sort of partnership, is in some sort of political partnership or social partnership. Now, the AND campaign is not afraid of civic pluralism. Not theological pluralism, but civic pluralism. We don't believe in pluralism within the faith, but we do support the right of others in society to believe otherwise. We're not trying to create some theocracy. To effectively pursue justice for all in a pluralistic society, we have to engage non-believers. If you want to get a law passed, but you don't want to work with anyone outside of your church or your denomination, then you'll probably fall short in most cases, and perhaps you should. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 10, Paul explains that you'd basically need to leave the world if you try to completely avoid associating with non-believers. And if you never associate with non-believers, how do you evangelize? You can't. Again, we see this in the Bible. We see Ezra and Nehemiah partner with the king of Persia to build the temple and the wall. Those partnerships were key to accomplishing the tasks that God had given them. Joseph and Daniel worked with non-believers, and sometimes involuntarily, we know that, but certainly with a level of agency to accomplish important societal tasks to help believers and non-believers alike. From a historical perspective, Christians like William Wilberforce partnered with others to abolish slavery. Dorothy Day partnered with non-believers to support workers and fight poverty. We saw the same type of partnerships in the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement isn't the only example, but it's a good example of what is called co-belligerency. Because of common grace, the idea that believers and non-believers alike can come to correct conclusions, we can partner with others. Christians don't have a monopoly on good works in society. Francis Schaeffer said this: I can join a person who may not have any sufficient basis for taking the right position, but takes the right position on a single issue. I can join with him without any danger as long as I realize that we're working on a single issue. And so we do have to understand that when we join with someone, whether it's social justice, criminal justice, whether it's pro-life issues, you have to have some caution. You have to know who you're joining hand in hand with. Very important. But also, as we engage people we know, as we engage people who we see on our side, we need to do that with a little more conviction. We need to do that without changing what we believe just because we know or like someone. And I think there's a really good example of that coming out of Atlanta years ago. So decades ago, when civil rights leader Andrew Young won a racially charged and hotly contested mayoral race in Atlanta, Georgia, the legend says that the band played a more soulful note. The grassroots danced and shouted a more hopeful pitch, and the promise of democracy shone a few magnitudes brighter. Following Maynard Jackson, it was again much needed proof that the ideals of this constitutional republic could work as imagined, and that the equitable representation that the system supposedly guaranteed could include America's darker and disinherited people. Young was to go from marching in the streets as a civil rights leader to sitting at segregated counters to striding into the mayor's office and signing executive orders based on a fair election. It was poetic. The progress that it signified was profound. This is the kind of story that gives history a certain dramatic flair. With a mind full of innovative ideas, a Rolodex filled with key community and business contacts, and with a bully pulpit filled with political capital, he was ready to take his turn at the helm. Surely Mayor Young expected to step into the city's executive office the first day with his supporters' unqualified allegiance and a certain cachet and prestige. And understandably so. He had just won a very tough, big city election. But as he walked up on his first day, he wasn't greeted by cheers and adulation. Rather, he was accosted by a boisterous protest on the city hall steps. Not uncivil, but disruptive. Yes, much to his chagrin, he was the subject of a protest on his very first day in office. A protest led by Reverend Joseph E. Boone, a campaign ally known as the picketing preacher, who was with his committed group of earthy, pragmatic activists who didn't subscribe to the tenets of respectability politics. Young was stunned. He was taken aback. Reverend Boone, after all, was his friend. How could he be so disloyal? How could he be so downright unreasonable? Didn't he understand what had just been accomplished? This was a historic moment. Well, of course he did. Boone understood the gravity of the moment just as much as Young did. He appreciated and acknowledged the significance of the achievement. But he refused to be carried away by the moment or get caught up in the pageantry, so much so that he would neglect his commission. On this morning, for Boone, it was back to work. It was back to the business of standing up for the least of these, of seeing and speaking for those who are too easily overlooked and unheard from high offices of power. Young and Boone had stood together on the front lines of the civil rights movement. They had broken bread for weddings and for funerals. Their children loved and played together. They had a shared history and a shared cultural identity. But this wasn't personal. Young was getting picketed by a friend before he had even signed one piece of legislation as mayor or made one decision. And that was shrewdly by design. Boone loved Young. He wasn't indicting his character. He wasn't being malicious or being a hater, but Young was now a public servant in a position of authority. And Boone knew the influences and temptations that awaited Young as he stepped into that large, decorated office. Boone had to make a statement. Boone had to send a message in no uncertain terms that notwithstanding their relationship, the standard of accountability would not be lowered. Sentimental attachments would not override the needs of the people. He astutely understood that it was the perfect time to set the tone and calibrate the new mayor's expectations. It was as if he was saying, understand this, my dear friend, if I'll picket you before you even exercise your executive authority, then I'll certainly picket you if you ever move against the people. He astutely understood that it was the perfect time to set the tone. He was saying, I might not be with you in the boardrooms with the affluent power brokers of the city, but my protest is a prayer that the cry of the people will ring in your ears in every smoke-filled room. From the projects of the West Side to the clandestine planning and zoning negotiations. We may not be in attendance, but may the groan of the people echo throughout the room and haunt you, should you turn from it. Neither familiarity, party affiliation, cultural identity, or the historic narrative were going to keep the picketing preacher from serving the people, from serving his purpose in the public square. The divine source to which Boone had entrusted his public witness disallowed partiality on account of fondness, discouraged timidity in the face of power, and disapproved of selective principles. It's not that he didn't trust Young personally. It's that he didn't trust fallen humanity with unchecked power. He had no reason to question his motives, but he wanted to strengthen his will and fortitude to serve the vulnerable first and foremost. He knew that the system had a way of seducing even the most well-intended, and he wanted to give his friend a few calluses to protect his spirit. He wasn't being disloyal to Mayor Young. He was being faithful to a much higher commitment. He was preemptively correcting him in hopes that at the end of the day, he would be able to applaud him. Unfortunately, most of us do the opposite. We elect someone and we immediately defend them uncritically. We turn a blind eye to corruption and excuse their failings to justify ourselves. We give out unconditional passes based on party and tribal affiliation, class and cultural identity, flattering storylines, and flowery narratives. Our posture must change. We must do politics more faithfully. When we partner, when we hold people accountable, what we believe and what we do must always have integrity. We must always remember that our public witness is an application of the gospel in the public square. Thank you.